So we're here today with Steve Fleegel and Mike Dutter from the National Weather Service up in Marquette, and they're going to be discussing with us some of the conditions that led to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, particularly from a weather point of view. So how are you guys doing today?
Doing good. Good. How are you doing?
Everything is good.
Good.
What's the weather up there like?
Pretty foggy, cloudy, but it's still pretty nice for this time of year. About 10 degrees above normal, so can't complain. It's not snowing yet, so we're
That's always good. So I know that up in Marquette and around Lake Superior in November, you guys tend to get some pretty bad storms. What's it like up there when you get these gales coming in?
Yeah, it makes it pretty interesting, and it's actually kind of pretty in some ways, just seeing the large waves. And we actually even get some surfers that go out there at times when in these larger waves. But anytime we get those large waves, it can get quite dangerous for for anyone even near the water. Last year we had a really strong storm that ended up throwing rocks several feet inland from just the large waves. So anyone that would get close to the water, they have the potential to get swept away, and that actually happened in the past where some students at the local college here got swept away on one of the break walls. So definitely a dangerous situation around here when we do get those gales.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like something you should mess with. Wow. So one of these November gales was what took down the Edmund Fitzgerald, right? They were out there 40 years ago now. They had gotten the storm warnings, but things tended to change, and they changed pretty quickly. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what the situation was when they first left, and then as it changed throughout their trip?
Sure. Yeah. So the Fitzgerald, when she departed Superior, Wisconsin, it was there. There was an idea that there was going to be a decent storm coming up through the Great Lakes. The Chicago office, who had forecast responsibility for Lake Superior at that time, did have gale warnings out for Lake Superior and when the Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin. And as the low developed over the Plain States and moved towards the Great Lakes region, it was obvious that the storm was going to be stronger than what was predicted. So storm warnings were issued, and as the storm came up, the Fitzgerald was at that point had to keep going basically, but they took precautions. They went across the northern part of the lake and to stay out of the strong waves or the large waves, and just try to take the winds and the waves as best they could. But as the low passed to our northeast, the winds rapidly shifted around to the west northwest, and at that point, the Fitzgerald was over the close to Whitefish Point actually, and that was the point where she ran into a lot of obviously ran into the trouble that she had and sank, and again it was that rapidly shifting winds from those southerly to northeasterly to southeasterly winds that were occurring the day before, to then rapidly the winds that shifted to the west northwest during the day, late in the day on the 10th, that caused the major problems, as well as the increase in the waves of 10 to 20 feet within a couple hours. That's how high the waves increased in just a few hours.
Wow. I mean, obviously these storms are not completely uncommon in Lake Superior, but was this particular storm unusual? Was it a once in a lifetime kind of storm, or how often would you expect to see something this bad?
It was definitely a strong storm, but it wasn't really anything too unusual. You generally see something like that every few years, every 5 years or so. One of the bigger storms that happened to move through the area, and especially the UP, produced the strongest pressure was back in 1940, the Armistice Day storm. That was the record lowest pressure of a system that moved through upper Michigan for November. But even in recent years, 1998, there was a storm that followed a very similar track, but a little bit farther to the west, and it was actually even stronger than the Edmund Fitzgerald storm. Similar storms occurred in 2001, 2010, and then even last year, that Veterans Day storm that I mentioned, where we kind of had the rocks that ended up getting thrown inland. So it definitely happens up here, and it kind of ties into the where you always hear the gales of November for Superior. So it's fairly common.
Now, those wave heights that they were dealing with, is that would those be considered pretty normal for a storm like this? Or, I mean, how high do the waves get?
Well, the waves, we back in 2005, a couple colleagues of mine and I did some research on the Fitzgerald and mainly the wind and the waves during the Fitzgerald, the trip as well as the sinking, and some of our modeling suggested that waves could have gotten to up to as high as 25 to 28 feet. And again, that was in a very short period of time when that happened. It was just literally a few hours from when it was 5 to 10 feet to 20 to 25 feet to even 28 feet. Waves like that are very high for Lake Superior. We do frequently see waves approaching 15 to 20, maybe even 20, 21 feet. That actually happens every few years, but those extreme waves, 25 to 30 feet, those are pretty rare. The storm that Steve mentioned with the October 2010 storm, I believe we had waves at the buoys of a little over 20 feet, which, again, that isn't so uncommon, but once you get waves of 25 to 30 feet, that is starting to be, again, pretty rare, especially with this, as across the eastern part of the lake with that type of a fetch, that west to northwest fetch.
What it sounds like you're saying is that something like what happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald could possibly happen again. I mean, I know there are ships that have difficulties quite often, and lots of people have lost their lives on the Great Lakes. So, I mean, it sounds like it's not something that was just a freak occurrence, but that this is a real a real battle out there sometimes.
Yeah, it definitely is, and when we've had these type of situations in the past, and we'll continue to see them, as we go through. And I mean, one of the recent examples was with Hurricane Joaquin, and the cargo ship that ended up sinking. Weather definitely plays a role in a lot of these type of events in the past, and likely will in the future. It's usually a combination, and weather's a decent part of it, and there's always something else that kind of ends up going wrong or occurs that ends up kind of adding on and causing the ship to sink.
And I'd like to add that the Fitzgerald was, again, according to some of our studies, and was literally in the worst place at the worst time with regards to weather. The waves were at their peak right at the time that she sank, and also the winds were at their peak as well, close to storm force, 45, 50 knots, of wind. So, and it was a short window, unfortunately, that the wind and waves were really high. But unfortunately, again, the Fitzgerald was just at the worst place at the worst time. And so, like Steve said, a lot of it is, it's the weather, but it's also the timing, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you read the NTSB report, it's like a 20 or 15-minute, 20-minute window from when the Arthur Anderson could see them, and then from when there was nothing else. The ship had gone down, they could see the shore, they could see other ships, but the Fitzgerald was gone. So it was fast.
Yeah, it was, all indications was that the Fitzgerald, it was well, at that point it probably would have been a snow squall that came through, and most likely with that squall there were probably even worse winds and worse waves than what even the Anderson was seeing at that point. So right in that small little area. So who knows exactly how bad the conditions really were right at the time of the sinking. I mean, we know it was really bad, but it could have even been worse than what the Anderson saw.
Okay. And one of the interesting things in the field of meteorology is that 40 years on, a lot of things have changed. A lot of the technology has changed, but a lot of it changed because of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And forecasting got better and things improved. So can you talk a little bit about what it's resulted in for your field?
Yeah, the two big things, you kind of mentioned that with the forecast models improving and the observations are the big thing. Before the Edmund Fitzgerald went down, there was a few observations with the lighthouse, but we didn't have the buoy system like what we have now, where we have buoys in the western, central, and eastern part of Lake Superior. And there's a significantly larger amount of observations, even along the shoreline, that really help us understand what's happening at the current time. And the advantage with that is all those observations now can go into all the forecast models, And then the forecast models have improved because of the observations and just the computing power from 40 years ago to now, that you can see a lot better resolution and detail on what's happening with the storms, and they'll end up capturing these type of storms a lot better, and doing a lot better prediction on them. And even thinking, when we were talking about the wave forecast, like Mike said, with some of their model simulations of that past event, where they were able to pinpoint pretty much right at that location that Edmund Fitzgerald went down what the waves were at. Whereas back when the forecasts were made back in 1975, they were just using essentially tables, and they would look at what the winds were, what the length that the waves were traveling across Lake Superior, and come up with wave forecasts from that. So it's definitely improved, and I think that's one of the keys with potentially reducing the opportunity for ships to sink in the future is we were just that much better, and can give that much more of a heads up on what's going to end up happening with these storms.
For sure.